This is Justice, History, and the Law. Lectures, discussions, and interviews from the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York.
I am Greg Peterson. I'm the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center. Judge Norbert Ehrenfreund has served as a trial judge of the Superior Court in California for almost 30 years. Officially retired, he continues to serve on the bench on assignment throughout the state. In 2001, the American Bar Association bestowed its prestigious Award of Judicial Excellence upon Judge Ehrenfreund, an award given annually to a judge in the United States as the Trial Judge of the Year. It's a big award. However, law was Judge Ehrenfreund's second career. In World War II, he served in combat as an artillery forward observer in the European campaign and was decorated with a Bronze Star after the Battle of the Rhine River. After the war, he became a newspaper correspondent and copy editor for the American newspaper The Stars and Stripes, covering events in Berlin, Nuremberg, London, and New York City. He covered such stories as the Nuremberg war crimes trial and the Berlin Airlift. From early 1945 to the end of 1952, he lived and worked primarily in Germany as a military officer and news correspondent. This period was interrupted by 18 months at Columbia University to earn a Master of Arts degree in political science under Professor Franz Neumann, one of the world's leading scholars on German history. From his experiences at Nuremberg, he decided to change his career from journalism to law. He earned his law degree at Stanford Law School and started his legal career as a deputy district attorney in San Diego. One of the things we just learned that he has in common with our Chief Justice, William Rehnquist, is they both had Phil Neal as their professor at Stanford University. Phil Neal was here, Chief Justice Rehnquist, as you know, was here, and now Judge Ehrenfreund. We have the trifecta. Later, as just mentioned, he started his legal career as deputy district attorney in San Diego. Later, he co-founded Defenders, Inc., a private law firm committed to defending disadvantaged persons in criminal cases. He worked there as a defense attorney before becoming a Superior Court judge in San Diego in 1976. The bio is replete with several references to speeches he's given throughout the world on the subject of Nuremberg and its legacy. He's also an accomplished writer, having written books You Are the Jury, co-authored with Lawrence Treat, which was published in 1992 by Henry Holt & Company. He's also in the process of having written a book which is currently out to potential publishers entitled The Ghosts of Nuremberg. In 2004, Judge Ehrenfreund was adjunct professor of law at California Western School of Law in San Diego, where he taught a course on the legacy of the Nuremberg Trial. And fittingly, at the commencement in 2005, the school awarded him an honorary Doctor of Laws degree. I'm honored and privileged to bring to the podium now Judge Norbert Ehrenfreund.
On May the 8th, 1945, World War II came to an end in Europe, the bloodiest war in the history of the world. But just a few months before it ended, in February 1945, the big three leaders, that's Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, they met in the city of Yalta in Ukraine. And they were there to decide what should be done with the captured Nazi leaders. They agreed that the Nazis were guilty of unspeakable crimes and had to be punished, but there was no agreement as to how this should be done. The British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, burning with the suffering of the British people, said they didn't deserve a trial. They should be taken out in the yard and shot. To give them a trial would only give them an opportunity to spout their Nazi propaganda. The French essentially agreed. Stalin said, look, when we met at Yalta, we agreed that they were guilty. We found them guilty. There's no need for a trial on that issue. The only thing left to do is to decide what the punishment should be. Back in the States, President Franklin Roosevelt was on the fence. His Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau Jr., was urging him to follow Churchill's view, just a summary hearing and then execution. On the other hand, one of his other cabinet ministers, Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, was urging the president to proceed with a trial. Now that summer, the summer of 1945, the representatives of the four major powers, they met in London. The four major powers were France, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. And they met in London to decide. The purpose of that meeting was to decide whether or not there should be an international war crimes trial, and if so, what kind of trial it should be. But what was the law? Where was the court? What was the court? Who had jurisdiction? What was the jurisdiction? There was no court, there was no law, there was no jurisdiction. They had to write the laws to fit the crimes. Then they had to draft the penalties to go with those crimes. I remember that summer of 1945. I was in Germany with the occupation troops, still in the army. My outfit, the 71st Infantry Division, part of General Patton's Third Army, we had fought through the war, through France and Germany and Austria. And as we were coming across the continent, we began to hear things we'd not heard before, about concentration camps and what was happening in those concentration camps. For the first time, we began to hear about gas chambers and mass burning of bodies. And gradually the news of these atrocities began to come out. The survivors came out and they began to talk. And the news spread across Europe and went across the Atlantic to America. Ladies and gentlemen, the world was enraged. What was this talk of trial? That's nonsense. The world was in bitter rage over what it was hearing. These despicable characters, people said, they don't deserve a single day in a court of law. Kill them, hang them, shoot them, whatever. But this talk of a trial is nonsense. Let's get on with it. That was the mood. And amid all this rage, amid all these cries for revenge, amid the criticism of this conference for even talking about a trial, one man stood up and called for a fair trial. One man stood up and called for justice. That man was Robert Jackson. Now, at that time, Jackson was still a justice of the United States Supreme Court, but he was not speaking there as a justice of the Supreme Court. Oh, no. He was speaking as the chief prosecutor for the first international war crimes trial, if there was to be a trial. Just weeks before that conference started, President Truman, who had replaced Roosevelt when Roosevelt died, President Truman had asked Jackson to take the position of chief prosecutor. It was agreed that Jackson could retain his seat on the court, be on temporary leave, and when the trial was over, he could return to his seat on the Supreme Court. And Jackson accepted the position and went to London. Now, why did Jackson do that? Why? He was a rising star on the Supreme Court. He had a chance to become Chief Justice if he stayed. His eloquence, his reasoning, his logic had already marked him for distinction. Why would he step down from that highest court in the land, a very high position, step down to become to become a trial lawyer? Why? Jackson had two passions. He had two passions when he went to London. The first passion was a passion for justice. Even before he was appointed by Truman, he told a gathering of lawyers in Washington, he said, "The world yields no respect for courts that are organized to convict." He said, "You don't put a man on trial unless you're willing to set him free if he's not proven guilty." The second passion was a passion for peace. He wanted more than anything else in his heart, he wanted to deter war and the atrocities of war. He really feared that civilization simply could not survive another world war. And he wanted to use that opportunity, the opportunity of that trial. He saw it as an opportunity he did not have on the Supreme Court, but he wanted to use that opportunity to send a message to warlike leaders all over the world. And the message was simply this, that if you commit war crimes, if you wage aggressive war, if you even conspire to wage aggressive war, if you commit crimes against humanity, then you could be brought before an international court of law and face serious consequences. Where did that come from? Where did those moral values that I just spoke of, those passions, where did they come from? Did they come from his studies at college? No, as Greg just told us, he never went to college. People are stunned when I tell them that. Who ever heard of a Supreme Court justice in modern times who never went to college? Did it come from his studies at law school? No, because he never graduated from law school, never received a law degree. The only formal training he had after Frewsburg and Jamestown high schools, the only formal training was 1 year at the Albany Law School. That was it. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't mean to curry favor with this fine audience, but those characteristics, those features, those moral values and eloquence, those features that led President Roosevelt to pick him for the Supreme Court, they had to come from here. His family, his hometown. This is where he learned to write. This is where he learned to speak with winged words. This is where he learned to debate. At Jamestown and Frewsburg high schools. This is where he learned the law in the old-fashioned way, by reading the law in a lawyer's office right here in Jamestown. His mother was a teacher. His father bred horses. And it was out of this rural American farm life background of the early 20th century that he formed the moral code that carried him to greatness. Justice must be done, he told the conference in London. A fair trial for every defendant, due process all the way down the line. Well, some of those allies, when they heard that, they looked at Jackson as if in shock. "Are you serious?" they said. "Are you really serious? You mean a fair trial for Hermann Goering, second in command to Adolf Hitler, the chief of the Gestapo? He ordered the concentration camps. You want a fair trial for him? A fair trial for Ernst Kaltenbrunner? He was in charge of exterminating all the Jews in Europe. A fair trial for him? A fair trial for Alfred Rosenberg, chief theorist of anti-Semitism? A fair trial?" Jackson was stubborn. He was adamant. He would not budge. "Yes," he said, "a fair trial for everyone." They wanted to know what he meant by a fair trial. and he laid it out. And it's from the London conference. The record is not clear exactly what he said, but we know from his opening statement at Nuremberg, from his other actions, what he meant. First of all, the presumption of innocence. And what a strange doctrine that was, especially to the Russians. The presumption of innocence. That meant, according to Jackson, that every judge had to look every defendant in the eye, had to be able to do that and say, I presume you are innocent. And I will hold to that presumption unless and until you are found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. What a strange doctrine that was to the Russians. In Russia at the time, when a man was charged with a crime, he was presumed to be guilty. And he had to prove his innocence. But Jackson was insistent upon the presumption of innocence as the first hallmark of a fair trial. And what else? Every defendant, Jackson said, must have an attorney of his own choosing. And he could have two if he wanted. And he could choose that attorney from anywhere, Europe, America, anywhere, if that attorney agreed to serve. And the Allies would pay for it. And thirdly, Jackson insisted upon a public trial. He wanted the public to know what was happening at Nuremberg. He even designed the courtroom. He set up a place for the press gallery. That was Jackson's design, the courtroom at Nuremberg. He set a platform for the cameras. That was his version of a fair trial. And the Soviet delegate, General Nikitchenko, objected strenuously to this version of trial. Nikitchenko said to him, this is nonsense. Your own president, President Roosevelt, found that they were guilty when they met at Yalta. They already decided that. What are we talking about? A fair trial. What's this talk about? And Jackson had to explain to him, that's not the way it's done in America. That's not our system of justice. The president doesn't have the power to find anyone guilty. The president can only accuse. He cannot find someone guilty. Now that debate went on for weeks. Sometimes Jackson got so frustrated that he threatened to walk out. All right, let each country try its own prisoners. But he knew the importance of having an international verdict, and he fought on as if on a crusade for justice. And finally, Jackson won out. And the conference agreed to go forward with a trial under Jackson's version of a fair trial. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that was a tremendous moment in the history of the law, a milestone in the history of international law. It ignited a revolution, really, in the international law, because for the first time, the leaders of a defeated nation were to be given a trial. The rule of law would be applied to defeat the leaders of a defeated nation. What Jackson was saying, really, when it comes down to it, he was saying this, and this was something we were hearing for the first time. But it all boils down to this simple but very profound statement that he was making, and that he had won at Nuremberg. And it was this, that every person accused of a crime, no matter how high that person may be, no matter how great that person's status or how low, no matter how heinous the charges may be, that person is entitled to a fair trial. And some of us, we look at that principle today and we say, oh, well, that's obvious. We know that. That's obvious, taken for granted. But I tell you, it was not so obvious then, not in 1945. Witnessed Winston Churchill's call for immediate execution without trial. Witnessed the fact that in some towns in America at that time, defendants charged with serious crimes were being tried without counsel. And that was what Jackson was saying. It was a time when America stepped forward. America stepped forward with Jackson's insistence on a fair trial to take over the moral leadership of the world. It was a time that ranks with that other time in history when human beings no longer punished each other just by the hue and cry of the public or by the thirst for revenge, but for the first time let reason and judgment govern punishment. I remember the first time I walked into the Palace of Justice at Nuremberg, the courtroom where the trial was being held. Outside, the city of Nuremberg lay in ruins, shattered by a British air raid. I'd walked in those streets right after the war. You would walk down those Nuremberg streets and you could smell the stench of death from the bodies lying under the debris. And that was the way the trial started, in that atmosphere of debris and death. I went into the press gallery and sat down, took my place in the press gallery. Immediately my attention went to the defendants on trial, sitting in the defendant's dock. There were 21 in all. The man closest to me, about 25, 30 feet away, was Hitler's second in command, the number 2 man, Hermann Goering. I looked at him. His eyes were moving around the room. He wasn't fat and flabby like people said he would be. He wasn't like that. Apparently he'd lost weight in prison. But he was looking around as if checking everyone out. And for a moment our eyes met. And I could almost tell what he was thinking. He was thinking, who was this youngster in the press gallery? What lies is he going to tell about me? I looked at them all, the defendants, the Nazi defendants on trial. Who were they? How could they? Were they human beings suddenly turned to beasts? Those are the feelings that ran through my mind at the time. Were they insane persons? Were we all capable of such bestiality? Those were the thoughts I had at the time. And I looked down the line and I thought to myself, how could this nation, this highly cultured nation, ladies and gentlemen, we are talking about the nation of Beethoven and Bach and Brahms, Goethe and Schiller. How could this nation of music and literature and science, how could they have produced leaders so barbaric? The trial opened with Jackson's opening statement, and that was a highlight of the trial. It was moving. It was a masterpiece. The press hailed it as perhaps one of the greatest opening statements ever made in a court of law. It was so eloquent. It was so moving. Just listen for a moment to his first words, the first paragraph of his opening statement, his first words at Nuremberg. This is what they were. May it please your honors, the privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. That 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. I've been a judge for 30 years, been involved with the courts as an attorney and judge for 40 years. I never heard anyone talk that way. I wonder as I come here and talk with you, I wonder if he learned that eloquence on the debating team at Jamestown High School. When the trial was over, well, first I want to say something else about that opening speech, because during that speech, he made a classic remark that should be remembered by anybody who was involved in the courthouse, in the courtroom. He said to those judges, and remember, Jackson was a prosecutor. He wanted to convict those defendants. He was not a defense attorney. But he also wanted those judges to be fair. And he made this classic statement. He said, to pass these defendants a poisoned chalice is to put it to our own lips as well. And what he was saying, it's obvious to all of us, he was saying that if you are unfair to these defendants, if you don't give them a fair trial, then you are degrading yourselves. You are poisoning yourselves. To pass these defendants a poisoned chalice is to put it to our own lips as well. When the trial was over, Jackson won convictions of 18 of the 21 on trial. 3 were acquitted. Of the 18 found guilty of at least one count, 11 were sentenced to hang. Of the 11 sentenced to hang, only 10 were hanged. And as you know, Hermann Goering never was hanged. He cheated the gallows. Somehow he managed to smuggle a cyanide pill into a cell. And when they came to get him that night, and I was in Nuremberg that night, when they came to get him, he was dead in his cell. So now, here we are, 60 years later. What did the Nuremberg trials achieve? Did Jackson achieve his goals? Were they worthwhile? Did it stop war? Did he stop war? No, he didn't stop war. There have been 100 wars since the Nuremberg trial. Did he stop, as he wanted to do, the atrocities of war? No, he didn't do that either. We know from Rwanda and Kosovo and Cambodia and Iraq. We know from Serbia and other countries, he didn't stop war, didn't stop the atrocities of war. Did he achieve, as he wanted to do, an international criminal court where war leaders could be brought to justice? No, not for a long time. Not for over half a century after the Nuremberg trial in 2002, just 3 years ago, did there come into being an international criminal court for the first time. And then, ironically, we're not part of it. And yet Nuremberg achieved a great deal. It had made tremendous contributions. First of all, it was a triumph of good over evil. Jackson convicted perhaps the worst criminals of all time. And I say Jackson did that. There were other prosecutors. But please remember that Jackson designed that trial. Jackson was the chief engineer. He was the driving force behind that trial. That's why I say that Jackson won the convictions of those criminals. What else? The principle of a fair trial, that every person is entitled to a fair trial. That has influenced not only international crime trials, but domestic trials as well. What else? The human rights movement. Jackson invented, really, the crime against humanity, that it was wrong for governments to abuse or be inhumane to their citizens. That was Jackson's idea, the count that he wanted in at the Nuremberg trial. Also, he set the human rights movement, he set it going. Immediately after the Nuremberg trial, as a result of Nuremberg, the United Nations made its declaration for human rights. What else? He set a model. The Nuremberg trial was a model for later war crimes trials. Saddam Hussein, he's about to go on trial in a few months in Iraq. He can thank Nuremberg and thank Jackson for the fact that he's still alive, the fact that he's going to get a chance to defend himself, because Jackson set that precedent of trial for war leaders. Slobodan Milosevic, the former president of Yugoslavia, former president of Serbia, he's on trial now at the Hague in the Netherlands. He can thank Jackson and Nuremberg for the fact he's still alive and for the fact that he's given a chance to defend himself in a court of law. Those men, had there been no no trial, no precedent set at Nuremberg. Those men might have been hanged, shot and hanged in the public square like Mussolini was by the Italians at the end of World War II. What else? What else did it achieve? He showed how low a highly civilized nation could sink under ruthless dictatorship. He set a model not only for war crimes trials, but a model of how to conduct war. He prevented those Nazis from becoming martyrs, which they would have done had there been no trial. And one more thing. He established the crimes of waging aggressive war, of conspiring to wage aggressive war. He made the crime against humanity a crime. Those crimes were established at the Nuremberg Trial under Jackson's leadership. And just one more thing, perhaps the most important thing of all. A few years ago, ladies and gentlemen, the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington conducted a poll of Americans. They wanted to see what Americans thought of the Holocaust, the murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others that Hitler didn't like. They wanted to see what Americans thought of that situation. And the results were amazing. They found that up to 20% of America either did not believe that the Holocaust ever occurred or doubted that it ever occurred. Now, had it not been for Jackson's insistence on a trial, on a fair trial, had he not insisted on that trial, on gathering all that evidence together, because it was Jackson that ordered the investigators to go out and gather that evidence for the Nuremberg trial, had it not been for that 20% who either did not believe or doubted that the Holocaust ever occurred would be much, much greater. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we here as Americans, we treasure our system of justice. We really do. We're proud of that system and proud of the way that system of justice and the tradition of fair trials is spreading across the world. Americans have fought and died for that system, and they will do so again. And someday, some evening perhaps, when you're sitting in the quiet of your room, or the quiet of your study or your office, wherever it might be, you're sitting alone and you sit back and you think for a moment about our great system of justice. And you think to yourself, what were the events that led us here? What were the events that brought us to this point of this great system of justice that we have? And you might think of such events as the Magna Carta, and the invention of the writ of habeas corpus, the Constitution of the United States, the Bill of Rights, the United Nations Declaration for Human Rights. And I want to suggest to you today, this afternoon, that you might add another event to that list. Jackson's victory in London for a fair trial at Nuremberg. A victory for him, but a greater victory for humanity. Thank you.
Times like this, I normally ask the speaker if he would give me his notes so we can print them. Obviously, there were no notes. And Steve, for your use for tomorrow's newspaper, it's probably a good way just to kind of wrap this up. There was a report which you get off the internet, and it talked about a speech that he gave on July 9th, 2003 in Canada. The latest in our series of seminars on international law was an exceptional event. Judge Ehrenfreund, a judge of the Superior Court of California, gave his account of how, as a young reporter, he was present at the Nuremberg Tribunal and witnessed what for so many of us is the starting point for holding individuals responsible for grave crimes against humanity in international peace. His address was eloquent and compelling, remarkable in that he spoke for 40 minutes without referring to a single note. Everyone in the room hung on his every word. To that I add, thank you 2 years later. for that. It was just terrific. I am mindful of the clock and the fact that some of us have to go back to work. So, however, there is time for a few questions if anybody would like of Judge Ehrenfreund. I'll start. Go ahead, Ernie.
The British and the French accede to Roosevelt and Truman's insistence that they have the trial. I mean, and then why did they permit an American to do it?
Well, that's a very good question. Thank you. Jackson went to London for that conference as one of the representatives, as the chief prosecutor, and really as the chief United States representative to that conference. You say, why did they accede to that idea of a fair trial? That was Jackson's energy. That was his driving force. That was his qualities of persuasiveness, telling them how important it was to have a trial. He told them that the world tomorrow will judge what we do here today. We must be fair, and there must be a fair trial. They didn't want, the Russians particularly didn't want a trial of that nature. The French essentially agreed with the Russians. They didn't want it. The British agreed finally with Jackson. He had persuaded them, even though Churchill originally said he wanted them all shot without a trial. But that was Jackson's power. That was his persuasive force that led them to agree. That's why I say it was a tremendous moment in the history of the world that they could agree. Yes. Anyone else?
Judge, why don't you comment on, you covered at least two of the subsequent Nuremberg trials, Farben trial and the Krupp trial. Maybe for our audience, just a little background of those trials, because they were very important.
See, after that first trial, which is called the International Military Tribunal, after that first trial, there were 12 other trials, which I did cover some of them. There were 12 other trials. Jackson was not in on those trials. When the main trial was over and the verdicts were in, Jackson went back to Washington. And he turned all those other trials over to General Telford Taylor, who had been his assistant at the main trial. And General Taylor was the supervisor, who was the chief prosecutor at all of these other trials. These other trials charged industrialists, they charged Nazi judges, they charged doctors, and that doctor's trial was really something. I mean, it showed the weird medical experiments that the Nazi doctors were performing on behalf of Hitler, on behalf of the Nazi hierarchy. They were throwing, one experiment I remember, they would throwing these Jewish victims into ice cold water to see how long they could survive in ice cold water. It's an experiment for the Air Force, for the German Air Force, to see how long a crewman of an shot down airplane could survive. So they would take these Jewish inmates and toss them into this ice cold water to see how long they could survive. That came out in that medical trial. So there are trials of different categories: the industrialists, other generals, doctors, as I say, judges. And so there were 12 of those trials. And they were also very, very important. And Taylor did an excellent job. Yes?
It's clear from your brilliant lecture that you were very much, you were profoundly impacted by Jackson's role in the trial. I was just wondering, as a journalist at Nuremberg, whether you got a feel from journalists, say, from Britain, France, and Russia, whether they were similarly impacted by Jackson.
Whether the journalists from represented France, Britain, and Russia had that same impact that seemingly you and other journalists had on Jackson's performance at Nuremberg. What was their read?
They all. I mean, they could not help but respect Jackson, particularly. He was such a driving force. He had so much energy. His way of speaking was so eloquent. They were all moved, and they could not help respecting him for that. Every journalist did, to my knowledge, yes. I mean, Jackson dominated the trial. It was his trial in a way. It was his concept, his ideas that drove that trial. And they really appreciated what he was saying about justice and fairness. They really did. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
David.
Who made the decision, the guilty decision? Was it a jury?
No, there were 4 judges. A judge from the Soviet Union, a judge from the United States, a judge from France, and a judge from Great Britain. There were 4 judges representing each of the major powers. But there were 4 others, alternate judges, also sitting on the bench. It was not what we call a jury. There were 8 on the bench, but only 4 had voting power. The other alternates were just there in case something happened to one of the main judges. They got sick or something, couldn't perform. That's why they had 4 sitting on the bench as alternates. But it was not a jury. It was by 4 judges representing the victorious powers. And the Nuremberg trial has been criticized for that. Like people call it victor's justice. It's been criticized for only having the victors as the judges. People say, well, why didn't they call judges from other countries, neutral countries perhaps? And so it has received that criticism of victor's justice.
Yes.
I was wondering what kind of punishment the doctors received that performed such devious, despicable acts.
Yes.
What type of punishment did they receive?
Yes. None of them were hanged, but several received life in prison. Several others received various terms, like 20 years, 10 years, and so forth. But what happened to I want to tell you what happened to all the terms that prisoners received at Nuremberg. Because remember, we were in the middle, it was a strange political climate. We were in the middle on the verge of going to war against the Soviet Union in 1946 and 1947. We were on the verge of it. Many thought that's what's going to happen. We needed Germany's friendship. We needed Germany's support. We needed the support of its vast industry. And so, in order to gain the support and friendship of the German people, many of those Nazis who were sentenced to long terms, those terms were reduced, substantially reduced, and they were released. Yes.
One final question. I wonder if you could share on a historical event of which you kind of covered and also flew in, and that is the Berlin Airlift.
The Berlin Airlift I did cover. What happened, for those of you who might not be particularly familiar with it, as I say, the Cold War was going on. The Germany was divided into the 4 zones representing the 4 Allied powers. And in order for, the Americans were in Frankfurt, and up in north in Berlin was this little island separated from all the other zones. And Berlin itself was divided into 4 zones. But the Western zone, in order for us to get to the Western zone, we had to go through the Russian zone, and that was happening. Trains, trucks, and everything were going up, carrying supplies. We were supplying, the Allies were supplying the Berlin people because they were cut off by the Russians. The Russians weren't supplying all the Germans in the Western zone, so that was cut off. But one day, the Russians suddenly stopped the Americans and Allies from going through the Russian zone to Berlin. They stopped that. They said, no, we're not going to let you through anymore. They had guards at the borders. We couldn't go up there by train or truck or any other means. The only way we'd go up there was to fly up there. But how could you supply thousands, hundreds of thousands of people just by air? Well, the Americans decided to do what they called a Berlin airlift. And they sent hundreds and hundreds of airplanes from Frankfurt flying up to Berlin, carrying coal, food, supplies to keep the Berlin people alive. And that was an amazing thing. I flew in one of those planes because I wanted to write a story about the Berlin airlift. I didn't have a seat. I sat on a bag of coal. But the planes, that night that I flew, the planes were lined up, scores of planes, maybe 50 planes at the airport, and they were taking off. One every 3 minutes would take off. They would go up to Berlin, unload their supplies, and then return to Frankfurt to take on another load. Night and day, that was happening, and we were keeping the Berlin people alive that way. And that way we won also. We won the friendship and support of the German people.
On behalf of the Robert Jackson Center, I just can't thank you enough, Judge, for being part of us today.
I just want to say one thing. I've never been in Jamestown before. I arrived here for the first time last night. But I tell you, I've been overwhelmed by your generosity, your kindness, and everywhere, wherever I've gone. I've been overwhelmed by it. It's such a warm community, and I want to thank you all for that. Thank you all.
We stand adjourned.
The Jackson Center is a historical and educational facility dedicated to preserving the legacy of this country lawyer who became Solicitor General, Attorney General, a Justice of the Supreme Court, and served as Chief Prosecutor at the Nuremberg Trials of Nazi war criminals following World War II. To learn more about this program, Robert Jackson, the Jackson Center, and upcoming events, the Jackson Center is located at 305 East 4th Street, Jamestown, New York, and found on the web at www.roberthjackson.org or contacted by telephoning 716-483-6646.